Hey, good evening, guys. Ken at Tortoise Capital. This is the Foundation's Q&A and check-in for December 28th, 2023. So I want to recreate a non-recorded story from last Sunday that we did in the Foundation's Q&A. There was only a couple of us, Ilker and Greg and I. And I really liked the sound of it when we were done, and I was sad that we didn't record it. And I don't know why I didn't record it. And I'm going to be referring to some of these two diagrams that come out of true storytelling. Briefly, the idea of the walking man and the 5 ways of knowing: the head, the heart, the gut, the hands, and the feet, and why each of those ways of knowing contribute to our overall understanding of the world around us, and they all are part of the decision-making process, so that as the walking man goes forward out into the world, all 5 of those ways of knowing are having an impact on how we make decisions. And each of those generates different kinds of knowledge. At the same time, when our walking man walks around and he comes into a true story circle, I think of it as a roundabout. In the middle of that roundabout, there's all these R words that are going to happen. Like in a true storytelling circle, it's built on these principles of safety first, then mutual trust with the people that are there, and then a commitment to tell the truth. And this inevitably leads to opportunities, because what we're doing in that roundabout is resting, reflecting, relating, rendering, conducting reconnaissance, restorying, remembering, reminiscing, all that. And we are safe and free to stay in that roundabout with others and with ourselves as long as we want. And people come to it, and they leave it from different points on that dynamic circle. And so I like to think of, the path through life as being, time I spend in roundabouts and time that I spend on the pathway. And so you end up getting this kind of network effect of people wandering around. And then periodically what happens is you get into this true story circle. And as you know from the circumnavigating the elephant lesson, the person who is telling the true story, and that was the first thing that I started studying when I started studying true storytelling, was the teller and the relationship to the story. The more time that I spend in the story circle, I realize that the important part of this, of true storytelling, is the true listening that's happening from all the people that are in that sacred circle. That what makes this storytelling magical is the fact that we're lowering our defenses and barriers, and we got all these different people that are experiencing that story from all these different points of view, and each one of those points of view is unique because the pathway that you took to get to that place is different. And because of the trust and truth that we're sharing, we have the opportunity to engage in collective thinking or story thinking. And our brains are optimized for exactly that kind of collaboration with trusted others. And that what's often missing in the world today are those connections of trust, safety, and truth. And one of the things that happens with social media and modern living is the isolation of people from other people. And you only get superficial relationships between two people that might My defensive boundaries are such that only a mere trickle of information can traverse, whereas inside a tribe, we have the collective wisdom of the tribe working together with trust, and then we can tap into all of that. Well, why is our brain wired in that way? Why was that a successful adaptation in the world? And here's how I think it happens. This is my story about it anyway. I want you to think about the scout, as a member of the tribe. And the scout is going to go out into the world for the tribe and try to understand things about the world, and then is going to come back and tell a story about that in that sacred story space. So the scout knows that. And when he leaves the perimeter, the leader in the tribe wish him well and they're praying for him. And he carries with him the obligation to come back with as much truth as he can to survive and come back so that the tribe may thrive. And he knows that when he leaves, so he's paying attention to every little step that he's taking along the way. And he's trying to see what he can see along the way, along that path. And he's out there engaging in the world and trying to remember everything and maybe bringing back artifacts or samples or food or whatever. And he comes back and he's going to tell a story about it. Against all odds, in a dangerous world, he's able to successfully come back and comes into that story circle. And it's a big deal. And, we're going to tell that story around a campfire at night, and it's going to be amazing. And around him, there's maybe 50 people. And they are all emotionally primed to listen to the story that's being told. Because we don't know what tomorrow may bring. And this may be the only time that we get to hear that story. So we're incentivized to listen to it in every detail and capture it for our memories and store it away and for the tribe. And some members of that tribe are so good that their job is not to be the scout anymore, but their job is to be the tribal memory and to remember all these stories so that they can be told to future generations. Because those stories are important, and if the scout dies, we still got to be able to remember what the scout said and pass that forward. So the stories are really important because they carry so much information that's important. And then the ones that really survive and are reinforced and seem to be super become lore. It's even more, it's a capital S story. It's the sacred knowledge. And some of that gets embodied in the elders who can choose which piece of lore is the most important for the situation that we're in, and the ability to select from the lore, which is the collection of all stories, is the responsibility and the job of the wise elders and leaders to choose and to ratify. And then if that tribe is successful, eventually that knowledge becomes epics, which can influence people across millennium. And those epics can be encoded in artifacts, poems, cave paintings that somehow take the essence of all these stories through the epic and then convert that into enduring pieces of art that carry a lot of power because all of the things that mattered from the stories are encoded in the artifacts and they move us. Well, here's what happens with our brain. I want you to think about, and this was the magical insight from Sunday. I'd never thought of it in this way before. That, well, we have storytelling, and now I realize that we have story listening, and that there's something magical in the connection between the storyteller and the story listener. And those things taken together end up describing an approach to thinking about the world that's all encompassing, and which for millions of years gave us an evolutionary advantage. And it wasn't until the Enlightenment, really the Greeks, and then the Enlightenment, that rational thinking and the scientific method adds if we have story thinking, there is a very thin veneer of rationality that sits on top of story thinking, which I'll call rational thinking or scientific method. And our fascination with rational thinking can cause us to devalue or disrespect the story thinking, which is the encoded embodiment of all our survivalist type thinking. It's useful. It may not be true in the objective sense, but it's being judged by different criteria. It promotes the survival of the tribe in times of chaos. So here's what I think happens inside our brains when this story is being told. That story gets decomposed into all the little pieces and parts: actors, sequence, plot twists, timing, events, insights, details. And all those things become what David Bogie calls anti-narrative, or the elements prior to the story. He calls it anti-narrative. And these are just the individual atomic pieces, like that character. Well, the story is somehow a integration of all those things, and the plot ties those together in some logical manner, whether it's time or space or whatever. And that is one form of that story. And that story gets told from the storyteller, and then all of these 50 people in the circle are listening to it, and what they're doing is that when the story comes in, that message, it's getting decomposed and broken apart inside your head and then being stored in your neural network of memories. And it's some of it's being stored over here and some over there and some over here, however our brain stores these things non-linearly. And when you recognize a character, it gets associated with the other stories you know about that character. And then the story of the tiger, pieces of the story that deal with the tiger are collected over here with the tiger. And then what ties that together into a particular story is the thread that connects them in time and space, and that's the actual story. So this is a very efficient way to store it inside our brain, and it's reinforcing the things that we know. And then if there was something that you'd never heard before, then that opens up a new part of your brain. You'd never heard of the story of a tiger before. So now we got the tiger element in here, and now you're starting to accumulate that. So it turns out that if there was 50 people in that circle and you telling the story, there's 51 copies. Each one is different and unique because each person is unique. And then whenever those people meet and they talk, those two people start talking about it later, and they're telling that story back and forth, their ability to recall the story is imperfect. I want you to think about the game Post Office. When you have a long chain of people, and this person tells that person a story, and then they repeat it, and they repeat it, and they repeat it, and they repeat it, and then you check in with the last person in the line, and you compare it to what they started off, and that message has changed beyond recognition. And that's because in each little transaction, the way you told it is different than the way they heard it and the way they remember it, and then the way they tell it is different than the way they heard it, because that's the way your brain is inefficiently storing this thing. So you get this kind of mutation. the story mutates, because each, especially if it's complex, because each and every part of that story is like a gene, and it can mutate. And when you recombine it, the story is always different. And that's why you can reliably count on the story changing from the start to the end. Well, what happens? Well, what happens is that in the tribal memory, you have that first story, and then you have all these other 50 versions of that story, and each one is a little bit different, and now the story space is much richer and diverse than the original story. And what can happen inside the telling and retelling is that new insights about our world can occur, because you're actually collecting insights from the other parts of your brain that stored elements, and those things are coming to bear on the way that you tell the story. So the fact that we have imperfect memories and imperfect communication and that they morph is not a fault, it's not a bug, it's actually a feature of the way our brains perform story thinking. And so one little seed of a new story can actually trigger all of these opportunities for new creative insights, which don't have to be true in the rational thinking scientific method form, but it only has to be possible or plausible inside the story space. And so you can go from one tiny little event to this amazingly rich and diverse collective wisdom. And so while each of those individual stories may be different, like this version of the story over here is clearly different than this version of the story over there, what all of those stories share is what I would call, this is the distillation line. All of the broad, expansive, interesting parts of the thing in the conscious kind of trickle down into the roots and get distilled in, and codified into the important values and themes and identities that are part of the tribe. And if the tribe stays together and develops its own culture, that culture gets encoded in our stories, in our lore, in our wisdom, in our epics, in our artifacts, and in the choices that we make as members of that tribe. And that's where you get tribal wisdom that is a powerful force for evolutionary success, because when you're a member of that tribe and you're inside the tribe, you get the benefit of the inherited safety, trust, and truth, which creates an opportunity to succeed in the world once you leave that sacred roundabout and go out to explore. And when the scout makes that sacred journey out into the world, he's coming back fully aware that what he's got to do is bring that knowledge back to the tribe so it can join with all of the other tribal stories that are leading towards wisdom and epics and artifacts. And this is consistent with what we know from Taoism, for example, that there is a changing part. So if we take the story, we will realize that there is a part of it that changes each and every time it gets retold, but there's also an unchanging part which is connected to the identity and values and the underlying reinforcements of all the things that really matter. So when I hear the Allman Brothers play a song, they never play it the same way, but in fact, each time they play it a little bit differently, it actually adds to the power of the unchanging part of the song, which is the collection of all your memories about the things that it really means to you. What that song means to you is not all the millions of little details and pieces and parts, although they're not unimportant. It's what the story's built on, but it's the space in between. It's the meaning that we make. And so that turns out to be a really powerful evolutionary advantage. And I want you to think about the relationship between a mother and a baby. When they are exchanging eye contact and that baby is being imprinted with the mother, what's happening is oxytocin. Oxytocin is being released, and the baby is giggling and gurgling and googling, and the mother is responding with love because her precious baby, and they're creating that memory. The hormone oxytocin is being released, and that creates a reward for the social exchange of storytelling and communication between the mother and the baby. And that's why people in solitary confinement go crazy, is because they are cut off from the social interaction of the emotional fields and energy exchange that happens between two people and groups of people. And that's part of the power of the true story circle, is that you go into that already knowing that you're in a place of safety and that you can trust everybody, and that the truth that's going to be told is going to inevitably lead to opportunity. That is such an evolutionary advantage when you're looking at what's the one thing that every trading psychologist and trader that's been in this game for a while says about trading? Yeah, trading is a lonely profession. Why is that? Because you feel unsafe, you feel you can't trust other people, and you worry that what other people are saying is not true, that it's setting you up for falsity. That's why when you have an indicator and it says you should buy it, the little voice of fear is, it's saying, hey, the indicator is lying to you. No, the person who told you that the indicator can be trusted is lying to you. And so therefore, if I can't trust the person, I can't trust the indicator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invent my own indicators. And now I can eliminate the falsity of the other person. I can rely on my own work. Well, all of that leads to a very lonely approach to the markets. So one of the things that we're trying to create and are creating in our community of practice are the principles and the values of the true story roundabout: safety, trust, truth, and opportunity. And that we are coming to that circle by our own unique path. And in that way, we are adding value to everybody else in that circle when we engage in deep listening and internalize things and react to it and ask good questions and we talk about it. What we're really doing is expanding the genetic biodiversity of our collective tribal wisdom. And that's what gives the tribe a competitive advantage, and that gives members of the tribe an incredibly powerful resource when it comes to developing new ideas. If you listen to the 3 stories that were told last weekend, you had Jeff and Sonal, and I'm trying to remember, and Luke, who have been doing this for 15 years with us. Each one of their individual briefings, I said, was worth at least $1 million in terms of the new ideas that I saw and heard and realized the implications of what they were doing. And that's why you should listen to 4 of the briefings. Each one of their question and answer session lasted an hour. And then my discussion of how to integrate their 3 was itself an hour. That little 4 hours, in my view, is worth $1 million. At least, in terms of the power. It's really tens of millions of potential for the person that knows how to turn that into action in a risk managed way. So, in summary, remember that the scout goes out knowing that he's supposed to be like a big vacuum to get as much knowledge and information about the world as he can and bring it back in the best story he can that tells the truth as he saw it on his journey, and that everybody in that circle's job is to suspend disbelief and engage with the story as it is told so that they can make it part of their brain, and that when they start talking with each other and they tell and retell that story as members of the tribe, they're really engaged in the collaborative learning that takes us through stories to lore to wisdom to epics to artifacts, and which reinforce these common principles and values that we share, while respecting that each one of us is adding to our diversity because of the different paths that they took. And that means there really are no bad questions. And that really means that each time I tell the story from my perspective, I see that it's I'm telling it in a slightly different way. And maybe the way that I tell it this time is the one that really connects with you. But I also notice that every time I tell the story, I tell it in a different way, and I think that it's better. So this collaborative method of story thinking really is a collaborative style of thinking that Angus Fletcher says it's not a historical anachronism that should be replaced with the scientific method. It's really a standalone style of thinking that has survived contact with the world that wants to eat us for millions of years, and that the evolutionary advantage of story thinking, when it's conducted, in my opinion, is that when you conduct it as a true storyteller, aware of the different ways in which we encode knowledge and understand the world, and that when we deliberately engage in true story thinking and do that inside of a tribe, that we can now add real important value. And then the scientific method simply represents another really important way of understanding our world. But if you look at how fast and dynamic the world is and how slow we are in the scientific method of producing capital T truth that lasts forever, we hope, we got to realize that story thinking is a powerful way to engage in a chaotic and dynamic world that is useful, and it doesn't need to be evaluated by capital T truth, but the lowercase t truth of temporary, local, limited, useful knowledge can be acted on in a way that is promoting the survival of the tribe. How to act when you don't have absolute scientific certainty about what to do. How many decisions do we make in life could be rendered down to a scientifically valid way to answer? None of them. None of the important ones that involve morality and wisdom are reducible to scientific thinking. Story thinking is a way to think about how to address all of that accumulated wisdom and how to live your life going forward, trying to understand a complex world while we are attempting to also leverage the power of science and reason. There's all categories of truth beyond that we have to make decisions today that we don't have science to be able to render an opinion, and nevertheless we have to act, because we also know that choosing not to act because we lack scientific rigor is a choice. That may not be the best choice. In fact, if I'm staring face on a buffalo that's charging right at me and I'm standing here and I try to use the scientific method, should I go to the left or go to the right, and try to use science thinking to decide which is objectively a better way. And if I run out of time to come to that scientific conclusion while this herd of buffalo is coming, I'm going to get squashed because I was trying to use a scientific method when all I needed was uh, to remember a story that lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way, because that buffalo is going to kill you if you just freeze. So, I want you to take away from this memories of the walking man and the 5 ways of knowing, and why we've got to integrate all of those with respect, and then what the True Story Circle does for you, and how storytelling and listening can lead us to a wider style and method and mode of story thinking, and that this story thinking is our heritage, and it gives us story thinking diversity in the same way that genes give us evolutionary biological diversity, and that in these elaborate nonlinear word webs that we share in our tribal stories, we get redundancy, creativity, reinforcement, and artistry is what lives in and around these shared collaborative spaces. And that the essence of the relationship between mothers and babies, which produces the oxytocin, also works at the tribal level when we engage in story exchange and story listening and storytelling with trusted others. The positive social reinforcement of this feels good. It's because it's also releasing oxytocin because we are social animals. And I want you to realize that the post office phenomenon about how stories morph, that's not a bug. That's not a bug. It's a feature. It's the most powerful feature of story thinking, and it's what we get our genetic advantage from by being members of a tribe that has the best values, that promotes freedom, free speech, communication, value of the individuals, protecting the weak, supporting the strong, and taking collaborative action, and being able to defer some of our gains for the future, to be able to exist in multiple time streams and to have impulse control so that we can prepare for futures that we can imagine as told through stories of how our tribes survived times of scarcity in the past. That's why it's important to have good values in the tribe, and that you can choose the tribe. You come from a tribe, but you can also choose membership in different tribes. And that becomes your personal identity and identification. Well, that was part of the discussion that we had on Sunday. And what I asked Ilker to do was to record from his memory as many things that we talked about on Sunday as he could. Because if you have a recording, you can almost be lazy about it and say, look, I'll just go back and listen to the recording later. Or you could be active about it and you can say, I'm going to do my best to listen to it while it's happening in the moment, and then I'm going to go back to the recording and listen to it again, and then I'm going to compare the first time that I heard it with the second time that I hear it, and I'm going to look for the difference. If these are the things that I heard the first time, maybe these are the things that I heard the second time that I don't remember hearing the first time. Why? Because when we hear a story the first time, it's being told at 100 words a minute, but we can listen at 500 words per minute. And what we're doing with that 500, that extra capacity, is that that signal's coming in and we're chopping it into pieces and we're trying to make sense of it and we're processing. And as long as that story is proceeding along the way that we expect, we see that story being told right here and we think, oh, I've heard this. I think that thing is going to go on this path. And then we can test, but suddenly we get surprised and that story went some other place. And now everything that we thought is now wrong. And now we got to recompute and we got to go back in time and listen to all those other things. And we're trying to catch up to the story that's being told. So when that reprocessing is happening, when we are overwhelmed or we're surprised, is that we're missing some of the next parts of the story as we try to play catch up. So we are actually living, when that happens, we were imagining the future, but we have to go back into our memory of what was told and bring it up into the new future, into the new present, and try to catch up in the future story. We are exactly living in different time frames simultaneously, and that's why our memory of the story, of the event, is never the same as other people, because we're going in and out of phase. So what I asked Ilker and Greg to do was try to write down all of the things. So here's what Ilker remembered. He talked about the challenge of managing his emotions. So we spent some time thinking about what the emotions are. The emotion is the feel when you respond to the events of the moment and how you feel about it, and that emotion actually gives you the energy to do something about it. But if you don't do anything about it, then the energy of the emotion is wasted and you miss the learning opportunity. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to recognize the emotions and then convert that energy into action, which could then be studied and turned into an artifact so that we can keep coming back to whatever the trigger was that caused the emotion can lead to an action to create an artifact, and then I can recreate that trigger without having to wait for the trigger. I can choose to reflect on the artifact. So when I get my little library of artifacts, each one of those things are powerful forces for future reflections. And then that's where my learning library comes from, right? All of my memories and the things that I choose to put into artifacts. So we connected it to some discussion about impulse control and how losses and an effort to do quick recovery, that's a certain style of action that is not equal to whatever your rules for trading. So if I have a system and it's supposed to behave with those 4 criteria and it's supposed to behave in a certain way, if I don't like the result occurs, if I have emotions and I don't like that result and then I take a bunch of impulsive actions, those actions are not the same as the system. So now I've actually got the system that I say that I want, and then I have the system that I actually have, which is what Kevin was talking about earlier. So we follow that up. So I said, hey, look, the emotions are normal, and they actually allow you to connect to the herd. And as our edge is going against the herd, and sometimes with it, emotions are actually really powerful. Because chances are, if you're a member of a species that has herd-like behavior like humans, and you're operating out here, and yet these certain events in the world occur, and they affect you and they affect the herd, and then as a result of that event hitting you at the boundary of your perception, you start getting triggers and emotions. Chances are a large portion of that herd is feeling the same emotions. So if you know and you document all the times that you felt an impulse to act, and you could turn that into code, and you can say, these were the circumstances that reliably produced a trigger in me and gave me an impulsive desire to act in a certain way. If you document that, what you actually wrote was a computer program that the world uses to cause all of these members of the herd, and it doesn't have to be all of them, it just has to be a lot of them. And all of these members of the herd that lack your impulse control are going to act in the same way. So one of the ways that we examined, how could I learn to manage impulsive behavior, is you could take the energy of the feeling that you wanted to do a quick recovery, and instead of trading it, you could actually take that energy and do the work of documenting the circumstances and take that energy and write the pseudocode and then use that as a program and say, if I followed that program, that's actually a system. That code is a system of trading. What kind of results does that system get? If they're good, I could actually follow it. So maybe I should actually follow the code, but I can make that decision on the basis of a rational analysis. I can do math, and I can study the results. And if the results are good enough, I now have the code for a new system. If the results were bad, I have the code for a new system which shorts or fades the emotional response. So no matter what, if I've held a strong emotional response, I should document that and then write up the code and then test the code for the results. And now I'm going to have a system that either goes with it or against it. And now what I've done is I've taken the impulsive behavior. I can now see the impulsive behavior, or the emotion that triggers the impulsive behavior, is a real gift. It's the gift of my monkey mind that's telling me, here's how monkeys behave, and all I have to do is play from between the impulse and the action. I just have to put a bulletproof wedge that I don't trade that until I've run that through the code and studied the results, and then make an adult decision on how to act. That's all we're doing, fellas, with the Learning Journal and developing the coaching eye. The coaching eye is the method that you use to identify the impulsive behavior and divert that energy into the code and enforce the protective wedge, the wall that stops you from implementing that action. I have to put a wedge in between the impulse and the action. That is how you manage impulse behavior, and the method of doing something constructive with it is like that. And then we said, look, so the emotions are just like electricity, and you can harness that and store it in your Tesla batteries for use later. Every time you successfully stop that impulsive action, you should reward yourself and put that in your Tesla battery, and then use that stored energy of doing the right thing to fuel right action, which is coding and studying the systems to come up with a new system of rules and then testing it. The energy from that comes from the professional satisfaction you feel by converting that energy into long-term beneficial action. And then you need to figure out how you do that. And then we went through a story that Ilker shared with us that when he was 13, he was thinking about lightning, and he asked his science teacher, why can't we store that electricity into batteries? And then the science teacher gave him the gift of a lifetime. He did not give him the answer. He said, why don't you go study that and come back and tell me what you found? And so Ilker took that and he went out into the world and he studied it. And he came back and he shared that answer with his science teacher. And the 13-year-old Ilker was launched into a career as an electrical engineer, which is what he does today. And the entire payoff of a lifelong career as an electrical engineer, which creates a living for him and his family, comes back to that moment when the science teacher, instead of just giving him an answer, gave him respect for the quality of his question and then engaged with him in the learning process, and it led to his life as an electrical engineer. That's the power of a coaching eye and storytelling. We're at 8:15, so I'm only going to go this far. But look at how powerful the fact that Ilker went from memory, it went from a story to a memory, and then I asked him to recall that memory. So he had to go back into his memory and reinforce the memory because he recalled it and brought it into his attention. And then he wrote an artifact and he gave it to me. And then I took that artifact, me, and I went into my memory. And then between my memory and that artifact, I just told you guys a couple of stories that you could then remember. And since I'm recording it, you can go back and listen to this story and my story about story thinking. And this is how you go from a single little event of a story into this grand, elaborate network of meta stories in a collaborative space that creates all kinds of new opportunities. And then I actually went through with him and described a way to simplify the Z3 pinch and the MMRB in a way that he could backtest as an electrical engineer that he would find satisfying. And I'm going to share that with you guys later, like maybe Sunday. And then we went into an examination of the tribe and the family and motivations, setting goals and family as key drivers of your behavior. That if your purpose in trading is to be able to support your family, the strength and power of the value of the family combined with your purpose now gives you the energy and the grit to be able to go on the learning journey towards trading mastery. That you're willing to put up with the pain and suffering of the journey and telling stories about that journey, because the values of the family and your tribe and your purpose is all geared towards that's why you're doing the work. So we even talked about the power of the question mark and the exclamation point as a really powerful icon that says you had a trigger that triggered your curiosity, and then instead of just getting the answer, it led to work, and then the insight that came from that work. Look at the power of that icon. So a simple little artifact of a question mark and an exclamation point surrounded by a circle could remind you of the story of Ilker and the science teacher and his career as an electrical engineer. Maybe that's the only artifact that you need to trigger that story if we used hypnosis and anchored that for you, and then you use that as a trigger for your own stories of the things that you want to remember. We said a little thing, hey, why do sharks have vertical fins and it goes back and forth, but dolphins and mammals have horizontal fins that go up and down? Part of it is dolphins and orcas can see the difference, and they know that things that have vertical fins are not members of their tribe, but things that move up and down are part of their tribe. Maybe that happened unintentionally, an unintended consequence. We talked further about how the motion of shark fins up and or back and forth that propel the shark are very much like the ebb and flow of the markets. And that what we do with regression lines, the 10-period regression line, the 30-period regression line, the 90, and the 270, is get these very smooth oscillations that allow us to make sense out of the chaotic movement back and forth, that we're able to infer meaning by looking at those different smooth waves. Information comes to us in waves. So when we see a wave of price action in the RL10, we're interested in the duration, frequency, and we're interested in the amplitude. Both of those things can vary. It can get faster or slower. How long does it take for the cycle to happen? And then the size and travel distance can change. So the amplitude can change. And the rate of change is the volatility that gives us an advantage in short-term price movements. That's why volatility matters. Changes in volatility. Rate of change is key. We concluded with some more things that took us back to the original story that got us launched on this excursion today, which was things like telling stories around the fire, the scout, why he's motivated to remember things, and why at the end of his journey his job is to come back and tell his tribe what he saw. Hopefully he brings back food, but it's more important that he brings back information. When that scout goes into the world and comes back, hey, maybe he's got a bunch of hunters with him. Maybe the first time all those scouts go out to 4 different locations and they come back with 4 different stories about what they find, and then on the basis of that, they decide where to go with the hunting party. Hey, we're going to go with the hunters to this one because that's where the game was, or whatever. So it's important that the scouts tell us important things about, hey, the antelope behaved in a certain way over here, and then we saw them over here, and we saw, so that's how the path that they take. And now the scouts, when they integrate their stories, we can develop a theory of how the antelope behave, and that becomes the tribal wisdom. So think about sitting around the fire. It protects us, but it also creates the emotional response that makes the stories so powerful. So now we think there's not only storytellers, but there's fire makers and fire tenders, and that water matters. Where rivers come out of the mountain, come down to the ocean, there's always settlements here. And when people build settlements near a river, they learn pretty quickly that it's hard to make a bridge, but if you make a bridge, you can live on both sides of the river. And then if the threat is coming this way, you can move to this side of the river across the bridge, and they can't get you because they can't get across. So now the importance of bridges between when 2 communities come together, building bridges. What do you think stories are between people? Stories are the basis of the bridge between individuals that allow us to share and exchange stories. And it may be that because the stories are communicating our values and our themes and what we hold important, we may realize that Group A and Group B share a lot of values, and now we could become inclusive members of a larger meta tribe, and maybe we can build physical bridges and combine our forces. That's what stories do for us. It allows us to build a bridge of communication between people and then between tribes in terms of the tribal wisdom that we can share with each other. And that intermarrying is how one of the easy ways that these stories come and live with these people, and these stories come and live with those people. And now we can learn, even if we're not in proximity, stories travel down the Silk Road. So this guy comes down and gets their stories and lives with them and comes back and tells those stories and brings with him artifacts which have value because of their scarcity. That's the power of art. We've encoded our values and are expressed in our art, and that's always of interest to these folks because they now can live vicariously and imagine what those people are like as expressed through the art. So it's not just goods and services. The power of art is that it encodes all of the values and identity of the people. Everything that matters, that endures, is contained in their art, and then we can reach out across our common humanity. So we'll spend more time talking about those things when it comes to the specific systems, because this is too good of an idea to hurry through. The essential idea was that if you had the RL10, the peak, and the valley, and this thing has encoded into a really tight compressed Z3 pinch, if you know that that's the size of the wrist box when it really pinches, you might actually see price temporarily come down to this support level, and that holds. And now when it moves off of that, a risk box, you have reason to believe that it could get back to here. So this is the essence of the supported spring crossing, that a period of winter that did not break now suddenly becomes your risk box. And as long as you can see 2 units of reward back to here, you can take the trade. And if it gets through there and then breaks out of the far side, you might actually see large R multiple, and it might take a couple kata 2s, but it starts with an SSC, whether you trade it or not, and then you might see the more reliable kata 2s until it comes up to test this. And if it gets through, aha, it's going back to the next highest resistance. That is the essence of the tribe as it moves through the savannah, and the power of the river as the visualization. That's what we wanted to say. It's now 8:27, and it's time to take a 8-minute break and get ready for the next, the nightly podcast. So hopefully you guys found that to be helpful and useful. Listen to that recording because that's top shelf stuff. I'm going to send that to Project Narrative at Ohio State University to supplement their understanding of where story thinking comes from and what it constitutes and why it represents a really powerful way of thinking in the world that doesn't compete with scientific. Imagine how good you would be if instead of saying, hey, is it scientific method or story thinking? And you said, hey, dummy, it's both of them at the appropriate time. Imagine you could do both of those. To know how to use math to test and investigate the stories that come out of our experience. Imagine you could integrate rational thought and story thinking. How good would that be? That's what you're supposed to find out. Imagine that you had a tribe that had people in there who could do this really well and who appreciated this, and then other people that could tell this really well. Really good storytellers, but they needed help with that. That's why I like to match up good traders with good analysts so that we can take the traders' intuitions and experiences and turn that into rule sets that we can test and create bulletproof systems that are both art and science. Aho. We'll see you in 10 minutes.